They called her the last Apache woman left behind. 3 days chained to a post in the livery yard. 3 days standing silent while men spat, laughed, and called her cursed. She would not kneel. She would not cry. She would not give them anything. In that same town, a man walked down the main street with no thought of staying. His name was Holston, a farmer, a widower, a soldier who had stopped talking about the war because no words could bring back the dead. His mission now was simple: keep the ranch alive, keep the fences mended, keep the days moving in a straight line. But that day, his path narrowed. That day, he heard the word auction. That day, silence met silence, hers unbroken, his worn down by years of grief. And in a single choice, Holston changed both their fates. Before we step into their story, don't forget to like this video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Now, come with me to Redstone Crossing, 1882. Holston lived the kind of life that narrowed down to routine, to work, to silence. 10 years he had been on that land alone. 10 years since fever carried his wife into the ground and left him with nothing but a grave on the hill behind the cabin. He had carved the cross himself, rough wood cut by his own hands, and dragged a heavy stone to mark the place. Every Sunday, without fail, he walked up there with his hat in his hands. He didn't say much, sometimes nothing at all, just stood in the wind, boots sunk in the soil, remembering what it was to have someone waiting for him inside the cabin when chores were done. The cabin still stood, though it leaned in places, roof patched with bark and tar, windows shuttered against drafts he never got around to fixing. The stove smoked if he set the draft wrong, and the floorboards popped with every change in temperature. But it was home, if home could still mean anything. Inside, the table he'd built himself wobbled on one uneven leg, and the bed frame creaked like old bones. He kept the place tidy out of habit more than comfort, as if order could make up for absence. Each morning came the same. He woke before the sun because sleep never held him long. He fed the mules from a cracked bucket, checked the latch on the shed door that always slipped loose, split kindling until his palms burned, and brewed coffee grounds slow by hand. He drank it black, staring out at the pasture where the fence line sagged and leaned like it carried grief of its own. He ate little. He spoke less. Sometimes days passed without the sound of his own voice, and when he did hear it, it startled him. The war had carved silence into him too. He'd ridden as a scout for the Union, sharp-eyed, moving ahead of cavalry columns, seeing what others could not. That kind of work demanded quiet, listening more than speaking. He came back from it leaner, harder, gray-eyed, with memories he never told. When town drunks tried to draw him into talk of battles and dead men, Reed turned away. He knew words didn't change graves. They didn't ease guilt. They didn't bring anyone back. So he lived on a narrow line: tend the ranch, tend himself, and let the years pass as steady as the seasons. The land didn't give much, but it gave enough to keep him moving. A few cattle, a thin pasture, a mule team that was more stubborn than strong. That was all. Neighbors didn't stop by, not anymore. They'd come in the first years bringing biscuits or tools, sitting awkward at his table while Reed nodded more than he spoke. Eventually, they stopped coming. He didn't mind. The truth was, Reed had built a life where company was unnecessary, or so he told himself. That morning, the light broke cold across the hills, a dry wind carrying dust into the seams of his coat. Reed hitched the mules to the wagon with the same slow steadiness he used for every job. He needed salt, nails, coffee, lamp oil. Maybe a new whetstone, since the old one had cracked clean through. Simple supplies. In and out. He'd be home by dusk if he didn't linger, and Reed Holston never lingered. The road into Redstone Crossing stretched straight and empty, lined with brittle brush and stones that had outlasted centuries of weather. He guided the team without hurry, reins slack in his hands, eyes narrowed against the sun. His beard had grown ragged, but he hadn't bothered with trimming. His coat carried the color of the road, dust ground into every seam. A man might have looked at him and thought him worn out, half-finished. But Reed was steady, and steady was enough to keep land and man alive. By the time the town came into view, the sun sat higher, catching on the false fronts of buildings weathered by wind and years. Storefronts lined the main stretch, hitching posts crowded with horses, voices rising and falling in the same patterns they always had. To Reed, it was background noise. He didn't come for the town. He didn't come for people. He came for what the land could not give him: salt, lamp oil, nails, coffee, nothing more. He steered past the saloon, past men lounging in the dust, their eyes sharp with nothing better to do. He passed the smithy, heat from the forge spilling into the street. He had no reason to stop. His mind was already on the return trip, on the hinge of the chicken coop door that needed replacing, on the fence rails sagging along the north line. His world narrowed to those thoughts, and he meant to keep it that way. But the town had other plans. It began as noise, sharp and uneven, rising above the usual clatter. Laughter, spit hitting dirt. The kind of crowd that gathered not for business but for cruelty. Reed heard it before he saw it. His hands tightened slightly on the reins, though the mules plodded on, ears flicking nervously. He might have steered clear, should have. But the road narrowed, bodies spilling into the street, blocking the way. That's when he heard it, one word clear above the jeers. Auction Reed's jaw worked once, the habit of a man who knew trouble when he smelled it. He didn't slow because he wanted to. He slowed because the way forward was closed. And in that moment, before he even saw her, before he knew what choice waited, Reed Holston's life began to bend away from the straight line he'd walked for 10 long years. The road through Redstone Crossing narrowed where bodies pressed in. Reed pulled the reins, slowing the mule team. He had meant to pass through quick, collect his supplies, and be gone before noon. But the crowd blocked the way, drawn to the yard beside the old livery stable arse, where noise boiled up like heat off summer stone. At first, it might have been a card game gone sour or a drunk brawl, but then he heard the words, clear, hard, cutting through laughter. Auction last one left. Worthless. Reed's hands tightened on the reins. He set the brake, stepped down, boots sinking slightly into the packed dirt. He pushed through shoulders and elbows, at men who leaned in close with nothing better to do than watch another person suffer. And then he saw her. She was chained upright to a rough-hewn post, wrists red and raw from iron. No slouch, no slump, just upright, chin level, eyes fixed on nothing. She did not look at the men who jeered her. She looked through them, as if the safest place for her gaze was beyond cruelty itself. Her dress was torn, once deerskin, fringed with beads and feathers that still clung in places. The neckline ripped low, exposing the curve of her chest. She made no attempt to cover herself, because there was no cloth left to do it, and because modesty had never protected her from anything. Her skin was sun-warmed copper, muscles carved from a life of walking, working, not breaking. Her hair hung long and black, tangled by wind and rough hands, braids half undone. She was young, maybe 24. The crowd treated her as a curiosity, as entertainment. Men spat in the dust, laughed loud, called her stubborn. One voice near Reed announced to no one in particular, 3 days she's been here. Others sold quick. Not her. Won't kneel, won't cry, just stands there. He spat again, shook his head. Folks say she's cursed or too proud to live. Reed said nothing, but his jaw clenched once, muscle ticking beneath beard. The woman, Awanada, though he didn't know her name yet, shifted her eyes for the first time. They landed on him. There was no plea there, no hope, no friendliness, no relief, just a quick, sharp reading of him. The way a person checked for threat, deciding whether to fight or to endure. Reed knew that look. He had worn it himself after the war, waking with sweat on his neck, reminding himself that no enemy chased him anymore except memory. He could have walked away, should have. Buy his salt, his nails, his coffee, go home, mend the chicken coop hinge, stand at the grave on Sunday and tell her again that nothing had changed. But he knew if he left, she would still be there at sundown. And some man with less patience, less restraint, would put coin in the handler's hand and claim her. And the outcome of that was certain. Reed's hand slipped inside his coat, fingers brushing the folded bills. The coins he had counted twice that morning. Not much. Enough for supplies. Enough for one last winter stretch. He stepped forward to the man who held the keys, his voice, low from disuse, rasped in the air. How much? The handler blinked, surprised anyone asked. Surprised Reed spoke at all. He named a number, more than she was worth to him, after 3 days unsold, but less than what Reed carried. Reed didn't haggle, didn't argue. He placed the money in the man's palm. The handler shrugged, bent, and unlocked the chains. You want a bill of sale? He asked. No. The iron fell away. The weight left her wrists, but she didn't rub them. She didn't move until Reed turned his back. Then she stepped forward, not because trust was earned, but because standing there alone was worse. Every choice left to her was a bad one, but some were worse than others. Reed didn't touch her, didn't guide her, didn't say a word. He walked to the wagon and climbed up. She followed, climbing onto the plank seat, her hands folded in her lap, shoulders steady. For a long moment, they sat without speaking. The sound of the crowd behind them carried, boots scuffing, laughter fading into memory. Nobody followed, nobody cared. Reed noticed the cold wind pushing in from the north, noticed how her torn dress would handle none of it. Without comment, he shrugged off his coat and held it toward her. She stared at it, then at him. At last she took it, but laid it across her legs, not her shoulders. The mules shifted into motion, hooves striking rhythm on the road Reed knew by heart. They left Redstone Crossing behind, silence stretching between them, not hostile, just heavy. Reed's mind circled back to his ranch, the sagging fence line, the broken hinge, the thin pasture grass, the silence in the cabin that had grown too heavy to carry. He glanced at her wrists, skin rubbed raw, glanced at her face, still as stone. And he wondered how long she had moved through the world that way, keeping her face still. She hadn't spoken a word. Not then. Not for miles. Not until much later would he learn her name. Awanada, taken in a raid, dragged across miles of scrub and rock, language beaten out of her by men who laughed when she refused to answer, left unsold because pride does not bend itself for anyone's comfort. Her mission now was not escape, not revenge, just survival, without kneeling, without begging, without surrendering what still made her herself. And Reed Holston, who had spent 10 years keeping land and body alive, keeping grief from swallowing what remained, found that his mission and hers had just collided. Not master and slave, not savior and victim, just two broken lines crossing at the edge of a worn-out town. Dusk laid its flat orange light over Reed Holston's land when they arrived. The fence line leaned tired towards the earth. The barn door stuck unless lifted just so, and the pasture grass stood thin and brittle, chewed down by cattle that never seemed to fatten. It was not much, barely enough for him, let alone two, but it was all he had, and it was still standing. Reed pulled the wagon to a stop near the well, climbed down slow, knees aching the way they always did after too many miles. He glanced once at her, the woman who had climbed into his wagon without a word, still sitting straight on the plank seat, his coat across her lap. She didn't look at him. She looked at his hands, studying the way he moved, the way men who meant harm often telegraphed it before they acted. He reached a hand to help her down. She stared at it, then stepped off on her own. Bare feet struck the packed dirt, and just for a flicker, pain crossed her face where the raw spots met stone. But then it was gone again, smoothed away like she'd practiced that kind of disappearance for years. Reed didn't press. He simply nodded towards the cabin, then moved ahead, opening the door and stepping aside so she could enter first. He didn't want her behind him, where suspicion might grow sharper. Better she saw everything plain. The cabin was one room with a short wall built halfway across to suggest separation. A wood stove in the corner, a shelf with a basin and folded shirt, a table with uneven legs, and two beds. His larger frame in the far corner, and a smaller one he'd built years ago when his wife grew too sick to climb into the higher bed. She paused in the doorway, eyes moving slow, taking everything in. The stove, the shelf, the nailed-down shutter, the faint scent of wood smoke and oil, and beneath it, the ghost of a woman's soap that lingered on things Reed had never thrown away. Her eyes stopped on the table, where a small ring lay, not worn, just kept. Reed followed her gaze, then slipped it into his pocket without a word. "Yours," he said quietly, gesturing toward the smaller bed. "If you want it." He didn't speak of locks or rules, didn't tell her where she could go or what she must do. He hadn't brought her here to own her, and he wasn't going to pretend otherwise. She stood still, unreadable, shoulders steady, hands folded in front of her. Reed gave her space, moving to the stove, ladling stew into two bowls, beans thick with the last of the summer squash, stretched with broth, thin enough to last another week. He set one bowl near her bed, the other on the table for himself. He didn't sit across from her. He left the choice to her. She took the bowl and carried it to the fire, sitting cross-legged on the floor, coat across her lap, eyes fixed on the flames. He ate at the table, slow and steady. The silence between them was heavy, but not hostile, just filled with new facts. Two people who owed each other nothing sharing, food under the same roof. Reed listened to the scrape of her spoon against tin, thought about the next morning. Animals to feed, fences to check, wood to split. He wondered if she'd want to help, or if she'd prefer to be left alone. He thought about the men in Redstone, calling her unsellable, when what they meant was she wouldn't bow. When the bowls were empty, he washed them, set them aside to dry, Then he laid an extra blanket at the end of her bed, another on the chair nearby, in case she chose the floor. He pulled a rough plank and a stack of feed sacks from against the wall, eyeing the space where he might build a divider come morning to give her privacy without asking. He didn't say it. He just measured the room in his head, the way he always did when building something new. Night settled without ceremony. He banked the fire, blew out the lamp. The cabin sank into a low orange glow. She lay on the small bed, eyes open. He lay on the larger one, staring at roof beams, counting knots the way he always did when sleep wouldn't come. He heard her breath even out, though not deepen. She wasn't sleeping either. Both of them listened to the stove creak, the night press against the walls, each other's quiet presence filling a silence that used to belong only to him. Reed thought of the grave on the hill, of how he would stand there Sunday, hat in hand, and tell his wife the truth. I brought someone home because leaving her there felt like leaving you, and I couldn't do that again. The guilt rose and settled, not sharp anymore, just present. He let it sit. Across the room, Awanada stared at the ceiling, heart beating fast, waiting for the sound of a door shutting, footsteps in the dark, the weight of a hand on her arm. None came. Reed didn't move toward her, didn't reach. He had given her a coat, a bed, and silence. She decided to stay awake long enough to be sure. She heard him shift once, then still. The night stretched long, but no harm came. Hours passed. The fire sank into coals. The cold pressed at the walls. Neither of them slept, but neither of them left. And that, on the first night, was enough. Morning would bring work, as it always did. What they didn't know yet was that the work would become their language. For now, surviving a single night under the same roof without fear, without demand, that was the start. The mission for both sides was simple. Stay, do no harm. Make the space livable. See if trust could exist without being forced into existence. Outside, wind swept across the frozen pasture. Inside, the low glow of the coals held. Two people, not yet joined, not yet strangers either, lay awake in parallel silence. And somewhere in the balance between grief and pride, between loss and survival, something fragile took root. Morning came cold, as it always did on that stretch of land. Frost edged the windows, pale light seeping between nailed-down shutters. Reed Holston rose before the sun, the way he always had. He swung his legs from the bed, boots pulling against stiff ankles, shoulders aching from years of labor. Across the room, the woman, Awanda, lay on her side on the smaller bed. She wasn't asleep, not fully. Her breathing was steady, but the faint line of tension across her brow told him enough. She had stayed awake too long, waiting for a threat that never came. Reed dressed quiet, stoked the fire, and put water to boil. When he stepped outside, the air bit sharp, the kind of cold that found its way into bones. He fed the mules, broke the thin ice on the trough with his boot heel, and scattered feed for the hens, same as every day. Only now, there was another set of footprints in the dirt beside his own, bare, smaller, pressed into the frost. When he came back inside, she was sitting upright on the bed, coat still around her shoulders, long hair curtaining half her face. She didn't startle when he entered, but her body went tense, like she didn't trust any room not to shift under her. Reed set 2 tin cups on the table. "I made coffee," he said, voice low from disuse. "No sugar." She looked at the cup. She didn't reach for it. Reed didn't press. He took his seat at the table, drank slow, wincing at the heat. He needed to say something, anything. But words weren't his trade anymore, so he spoke the way he always did, plain, stripped down to fact. "I'll be fixing the fence line today. North trails down. After that, the chicken coop needs a new hinge. Tools are outside if you know them. You can stay here if you want. Or come. Your choice." She blinked once, nothing else. Reed stood, pulled on his coat and stepped out. The cold slapped hard against his cheeks, but he welcomed it. Work was simpler than talk? Halfway to the north fence, he heard footsteps behind him, slow, bare. He turned. She followed, wrapped in his coat, her torn dress beneath, moccasins too big but tied snug against her feet. She carried no tool, asked no question. She just came. Reed didn't say a word. He set to work. The fence post leaned tired, wire sagging. He dug, drove the post deeper, tied the strands taut, reset the support beams. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw her watching, not idle, but studying. After an hour, she bent, lifted a second post. Her hands, raw at the wrists, closed around them. She set it upright beside him, held it steady as he tied the wire. Her movements were practiced, capable. She had done this kind of labor before. When her mouth cracked, Reed handed her his own without comment. She took it, swung again, arms strong, back straight. No thinking, no glance, just work. By midday, they rested against a log. Reed unscrewed the top of a dented canteen, drank, then held it out. She took it, drank slow, then passed it back. Their fingers brushed once, neither pulling away. The wind carried dust around their boots. Work became their language. That afternoon, they walked back to the cabin. Reed went behind the barn to chop wood. The steady rhythm of axe against log carried across the yard. Awanada disappeared for a time. When she returned, she knelt beside the chicken coop. The hinge that had been hanging by rust and wire now lay repaired, patched with scrap and a nail she had scavenged. She stood, wiped her palms, said nothing, and went inside. Reed watched from a distance, the corner of his mouth tightening, though not in displeasure. He didn't praise her. He didn't need to. She hadn't asked for it. That night she ate sparingly. A biscuit, a few bites of salted pork. She sat near the fire again, coat across her lap, eyes on the flames. Reed cleared the table, lit the lamp, pulled a handful of planks, and began measuring space near her bed, a divider tall enough for privacy. He hammered slow, steady. Finally, her voice broke the silence. "Why?" Reed paused, set the hammer down, turned toward her. "Why'd you take me?" she asked again, voice low, rough from disuse. Reed's eyes were steady. "'Cause no one else should have, and because I had room." She studied him, long and hard. Then she spoke again, firmer. "I don't want to be owned." "You're not? Not wife?" "No." "Not slave?" "No." She nodded once, sharp, final. That was the deal. Enough for now. Later, when Reed banked the fire, she pulled her blanket and lay down on the floor near the stove, not the bed. He looked at her, but said nothing. She didn't trust the cot yet. He didn't expect her to. Trust would take time. The night held steady. Coyotes howled far off. The fire warmed the floorboards. Reed lay in his bed, staring at the beams overhead. She lay on the floor, eyes open, watching the dark. Not afraid, not exactly, just alert. She hadn't run. He hadn't asked her to. That was where they were. Not family, not strangers, something in between. Bound not by words, not by law, but by the fact that neither had walked away. By morning, the frost would edge the windows again. Reed would rise early. She would too. And together they would pick up tools, mend what was broken, repair what could be saved. And without saying it, without naming it, they would both understand. Work had become their language. And in a world where trust was rare, it was a start. The first snow came early. At dawn, Reed found frost thick on the window panes, white creeping up the glass like fingers. By noon, the sky had closed over, low and gray, pressing the land into silence. The flakes fell fine at first, dusting the pasture and the sagging fence line, then heavier, thicker, until the road into Redstone disappeared beneath a soft white shroud. The ranch became its own world, a world of two. Reed rose early as always, splitting wood before the storm deepened, filling the boxes by the stove until they overflowed. He checked the barn, tightened latches, tied down loose boards. Awanada followed him, not speaking, wrapping his coat tighter across her shoulders. When he carried wood inside, she swept the snow from his boots without being asked. When he hauled water from the well, she set out the basin, warmed it over the fire. Their rhythm was unspoken but steady. That night, the storm howled against the cabin walls, wind finding every crack. Inside, the fire burned hot, the room glowing orange. Reed sat at the table, leather strap in his hands, mending harness. Awanada sat by the stove, cross-legged, braiding her long black hair. She broke the silence first. Her voice cracked from disuse, but carried steady. "Your wife, she die?" Reed's hands stilled on the strap. He lifted his eyes, gray and tired. "Fever. One spring, 6 days from first cough to last breath, buried her up the hill." Awanada nodded once. Her eyes lowered, lashes casting shadow against her cheek. "Children?" "No." She sat quiet for a long while, then spoke again. "They sold me because I would not obey. I was supposed to marry. I refused. My father said I dishonored him. After the raid, no one came for me. Maybe they thought me dead. Maybe they wanted it so." Reed didn't answer. He had learned long ago that not every truth needed a reply. He just looked at her, steady, and let the silence hold without judgment. Later she asked another question. "Why you live alone?" Reed rubbed the back of his neck, eyes fixed on the fire. "Because when you lose everything, there's not much left worth bringing back." Her gaze lifted, searching him. "But you brought me." Reed's jaw worked once, then stilled. "I couldn't leave you there?" That was the end of it. For the first time, her shoulders softened. The days passed in slow measure, marked by chores and meals, by the hiss of snow against the roof, by the rhythm of work and rest. Awanada began moving through the cabin without keeping her back to the wall. She tidied corners, stacked wood near the stove, brushed down the mule's coat after Reed came in from the pasture. She did not act like a servant, nor a guest. She moved like someone deciding, slowly, to stay. One evening, as Reed bent over the fire sharpening his knife, she watched him for a long time. Then her voice quiet, but firm. "I don't know what I am here. Not wife, not slave, not tribe. I wake, I work, I eat. I don't know what I am becoming." Reed set the knife down, leaned forward on his elbows. "You're someone still standing. That's more than most." She turned to him, eyes unreadable. "And you? Where are you now?" He breathed slow, heavy, tired, but trying. Her lips twitched, almost a smile, almost. That night, she did not lay her blanket on the floor. She took the cot again. Reed noticed, but didn't speak. Trust had taken a step closer. The storm thickened as the days passed. Snow sealed the road to Redstone, drifts piling against the barn. The ranch disappeared into a white silence, broken only by the crack of splitting wood and the low murmur of fire. In that silence, something shifted. Their touches became more frequent, passing the canteen, brushing shoulders at the stove, handing tools across the workbench. None forced, none hurried, just small points of contact that carried weight. One night, as the wind rattled the shutters, Awanada sat by the fire, arms around her knees. She looked at Reed, her dark eyes steady. "When they took me," she said, "they did not speak unless to command. I stopped speaking too. Silence was punishment." Reed's voice came low, softer than she had ever heard it. "Here, silence isn't punishment, it's peace." She studied him, long and hard, then nodded. For the first time, she believed it. Another night, she moved closer to where Reed sat at the table, her braid falling loose over her shoulder. She reached out, placed her hand lightly over his rough palm. He looked down at their joined hands, then at her. She didn't speak. He didn't pull away. That was all. But it was enough. The storm carried on for weeks, sealing them together. They spoke little, but when they did, the words came easier. Reed found himself watching her move through the cabin, noticing the way she mended torn cloth with bits of thread, the way she coaxed the fire higher without wasting wood, the way her eyes followed him not with suspicion but awareness. And she, in turn, began to notice the way he never raised his voice, never rushed her, never pressed where she did not want to go. The way he carried his grief without letting it sour into cruelty. They were not lovers, not yet, not even family. But they were no longer strangers. On the coldest night of that long storm, the fire burning low, Awanada stood by the stove, coals glowing red against her skin. Reed sat behind her, rubbing his palms together. She turned, stepped close, and placed a hand on his chest, right over his heartbeat. Her eyes did not ask. They just looked. Reed's voice was barely above a whisper. "Are you sure?" She nodded once. "I stayed." Then she stepped back, lay down on the cot. Reed sat for a long while, chest tight, listening to the storm batter the walls. He did not follow, he did not reach, but when he lay down in his own bed, his breath came easier. Because for the first time in 10 years, the silence inside that cabin did not feel like a grave. It felt like the start of something fragile, something real, something worth tending. The storm raged on outside. Inside, the quiet between them had softened. Not peace, not yet, but no longer punishment either. And in that small shift, something larger had begun. The storm finally eased after days of battering the land. Snow lay thick against the cabin walls, muffling the world in a blanket of white. The ranch was sealed in, still and waiting. But inside, Reed and Awanada carried on. Their days took rhythm. Reed hauling wood, tending the livestock. Awanada mending scraps of cloth, sweeping, cooking simple meals, sometimes standing beside him in the yard with tools in her hands. Their silence had softened. They moved around each other, not like strangers anymore, but like people who had accepted the other's presence. But silence can only hold so much before words press through. And on one evening, with the fire warm and the storm settled into a soft hiss against the glass, the weight of the past broke through. Reed sat at the table, sharpening his knife on a small whetstone. Motions steady, measured. Awanada sat cross-legged near the stove, braiding her long hair, her dark eyes watching the flames. For a long time, the only sound was steel against stone, crackle against wood. Then her voice rose low, deliberate. What happened to her? Reed didn't look up at once. His hand kept its rhythm, knife, stone, scrape. Only after a moment did he lean back, set the blade down, and meet her eyes. Fever, he said. One spring, came on fast. She lasted 6 days, buried her behind the cabin. Awanada's braid slipped loose in her hands. She looked towards the floor. Children? No. She nodded slow, like she had expected the answer. Her voice dropped. My father wanted me to marry. I refused. Said I dishonored him. When raiders came, they took me. My people did not follow. Maybe they thought I did. Maybe they hoped I was. Her words were plain, without plea, not shaped for pity, just spoken, because they had lived too long in her chest. Reed listened, jaw set, breath even. He knew what it was to carry truths until they soured inside. So he didn't fill the air with answers that would mean nothing. He only nodded once, steady, giving the space weight. Later, she looked up again, her gaze sharp, steady. What did you do in the war? Reed hesitated, his eyes narrowed, focused somewhere beyond the cabin wall. Scouts, he said finally, rode ahead of the lines, marked ground, marked men. Sometimes it meant saving lives, sometimes it meant the opposite. Her dark eyes stayed on him. You killed? He let out a long breath, not quite sigh, not quite confession. Yes. The fire popped. For a long time, neither spoke. Then she said softer, I have killed too. I was small when it first happened. My people were attacked. I picked up a knife. There was no choice. After that, I learned what it meant to stand or fall. Their eyes met across the glow of the fire. Neither flinched, neither asked for forgiveness. In that look, there was recognition, not of sameness, but of survival, of the weight both carried. Reed leaned forward, elbows on his knees. I came back from the war with less than I left with. That's not madness, that's math. Awanada studied him for a long beat. Then she nodded once, almost approving. The conversation drifted into silence again, but it was different this time. Not the silence of strangers, not even the silence of survival. It was the silence of two people who had placed truths in the open and found the world hadn't ended. In the days that followed, they spoke more. Short questions, short answers, but real. While Reed hauled water, Awanada asked about the land. He told her how the pasture used to run thick with grass before drought thinned it. When she patched a torn shirt, he asked who taught her to sew. My mother, she said, eyes fixed on the thread. She sewed everything by hand, even moccasins, even cradle boards. One afternoon, as they sat resting after splitting wood, Reed asked, Your name? What does it mean? She glanced at him, then away, as though reluctant. Awanada. It means she who will not bow. Reed's mouth twitched, almost a smile. Fitting. She didn't smile back, but the faintest light crossed her face, and for a moment her shoulders loosened. That evening she surprised him. They sat at the table, stew steaming in tin bowls, when she said, You buried her alone? Reed nodded. No one came. Just me, the land, and the sky. You carry her still? Every Sunday, he admitted. I stand at her grave, tell her nothing's changed. Until the day I brought you home. Awanada's eyes flickered, unreadable. And now? Reed stared into the fire. His jaw worked once, then stilled. Now I don't know what to tell her. She set her spoon down, folded her hands in her lap. For a long moment, the cabin was silent, except for the stove's low hum. Then she said quietly, Maybe you tell her you are still alive. Reed's breath caught. He hadn't thought of it that way. That night, when he banked the fire and lay in his bed, he found his chest less heavy than it had been in years. He still saw the grave on the hill in his mind. But for the first time, he imagined walking back down from it, not alone. Awanada lay on the cot, her breathing even. But Reed knew she wasn't asleep yet. He didn't speak, neither did she. But in the shared silence, there was something new, Not just survival, not just endurance, understanding. The storm outside had passed, but inside another storm, the storm of guarded hearts, unspoken histories, old griefs, had begun to ease as well. The next morning, Reed woke to find Awanada already on her feet, tending the fire. She moved with purpose, sleeves rolled, hair braided tight. She turned when he stirred, her eyes steady. "Snow still deep," she said simply. He nodded. "We'll dig out the barn. After that, see to the fence." She didn't hesitate. "I'll come." And that was the quiet proof of all that had changed. She no longer moved like someone waiting for the door to open and danger to enter. She moved like someone who had chosen, at least for now, to stay. And Reed, watching her place wood on the fire with steady hands, felt the faint, unexpected rise of something he hadn't allowed in years. Not relief, not peace. Something more dangerous. Hope. The storm had broken, leaving the land buried in white silence. Days passed in rhythm. Chores, meals, quiet talks by the fire. For the first time in years, Reed Holston no longer counted his days only by tasks completed. He found himself watching her, watching the way Awanada tied her hair back before work, the way she mended torn fabric with a precision born from necessity, the way her eyes lingered not in suspicion anymore, but in awareness. One evening, as dusk pressed shadows long across the cabin walls, Awanada moved to the table. She opened a drawer, fingers brushing along wood, worn smooth by Reed's hands. Inside, she found a small ring, simple, plain, a band of metal kept, not worn. She held it in her palm, turning toward him. "I saw this before," she said. Reed looked up from the harness he was mending. His jaw tightened slightly. It was hers. "Your wife." He nodded once. Awanada studied the ring, the firelight catching its dull shine. She did not cry. She did not recoil. Her voice was steady. "You kept it." Reed's eyes dropped to the table. "I didn't know why. Not for a long time. And now?" He hesitated, then stood. He crossed the room slow, deliberate, and held the ring out, open in his palm. He didn't kneel, didn't dress the moment in ceremony. His voice was quiet but sure. "I think I was waiting for it to mean something again." Awanada's dark eyes lifted to his. They held shock, yes, but not fear, not doubt. Weight. The weight of being chosen, not taken. She didn't reach it once. The fire popped. The silence stretched. Then finally, she slid her fingers into his hand, closed them around the ring. There were no vows, no promises made under heaven or law. Just a choice carried between them. That night, she lay again in his bed. But this time, she didn't keep to the edge. She curled into him, her head resting against his chest, her leg hooked lightly over his. Reed held her steady, his hand against the small of her back, feeling her breath rise and fall in rhythm with his own. For the first time in a decade, he did not dream of the grave on the hill. When morning came, the snow had begun to melt, dripping from the eaves in soft rhythms. The land hinted at thaw, at renewal. Awanada rose before him, stirring the fire, her hair loose down her back. She wore his shirt now, sleeves rolled, the torn deerskin dress mended beneath it with patches she had stitched herself. She turned when he stirred, her voice quiet but firm. "Coffee is ready." Reed sat up, boots pulling against stiff joints, and looked at her. She wasn't a guest anymore. She wasn't a shadow of grief, nor a reminder of what had been lost. She was present. She was his now. Not because he had bought her, not because circumstance had trapped them together, but because both of them had stayed. Later that day, as they walked the fence line, Awanada paused. She touched the ring where it rested. The small pouch she had tied at her waist. Her eyes followed the stretch of land, the snow softening into mud, the trees budding at their edges. She turned to him, voice thoughtful. This place, it holds both the dead and the living. Reed followed her gaze, the hill with its grave, the pasture trying to green again, the cabin, smoke curling from its roof. It does, he said. Awanada nodded once. Then let the ring belong here too, not to what was lost, to what remains. Reed didn't answer with words. He only reached for her hand, calloused and strong, and held it. That evening, as the fire burned low, Awanada set the ring carefully in a carved box near the hearth. Not hidden, not forgotten, placed where both could see it, no longer a relic of grief, no longer a chain to the past, a marker of choice. The snow outside melted slow, revealing the dark earth beneath. The world was shifting, softening, and so were they. In Redstone Crossing, they had called her unsellable. Here she had been chosen. And in the quiet of that cabin, Reed Holston, who had once told his dead wife nothing ever changed, now felt the truth. Everything had. By the second week of March, the snow began to soften. Icicles dripped from the eaves, falling into the mud below. The pasture stretched wide again, brown and soggy, but alive. The air smelled different now, not of ash and smoke, but of thawing earth, of roots waking beneath the soil. Inside the cabin, change had settled too. Reed woke one morning to the sound of Awanada moving quietly near the hearth. She wore his shirt, sleeves rolled to her elbows, the deerskin dress mended beneath with patches of linen. Her hair was braided tight down her back, her hands steady as she coaxed the fire to life. When she turned and saw him stir, she spoke plain, as though she had always belonged. Coffee is almost ready. Reed sat up slow, rubbing stiffness from his neck. He studied her for a moment, the way she moved without hesitation, the way she filled the cabin not as a shadow, but as presence. That day they walked the fence line together. The snow clung in patches, but the earth beneath showed dark and damp. Reed carried posts. Awanada carried wire. She worked without asking, without waiting. Her hands, once raw and bruised, now held strength again. At midday, they sat on a log, shared bread and dried meat. The sun touched her face, and Reed saw the faintest ease settle over her features. It was later when she stood from her work, brushing dirt from her palms, that she spoke. Her voice carried no fear, only fact. My monthly did not come this week. Reed froze. His eyes lifted to hers. She did not look away. I have counted twice. Maybe I am wrong, maybe not. But if I am with child, are you ready for that? For a long moment, Reed said nothing. His gaze turned out toward the pasture, the hills beyond, the cabin that had carried so much grief. He thought of the grave on the hill, of Sundays spent telling his wife nothing had changed. He thought of nights spent alone, speaking to no one. And then he turned back to her. She stood straight, her shoulders steady, her dark eyes waiting. I never thought it would happen again, he said. His voice carried weight but not fear. Not after everything. But if it's you, yes, I'm ready. Awanada's lips did not smile, but her shoulders eased. She stepped close, pressed her forehead against his chest. Reed placed a hand at the back of her head, holding her there steady, as though the moment itself might break if he let go. That night she spoke again by the fire. If I carry your child, I want them to have a name, a home. I want to belong here. you already do. She shook her head slightly. Not as someone rescued, not as guest, as wife. Reed rose without hesitation. He crossed the room, took the ring from the box by the hearth, and held it out to her. You sure? She nodded once. Yes. He slipped the ring onto her finger. Her hands trembled, but her voice was firm. Then you are my wife, he said. Not by law, by choice, mine and yours. That night, they lay together with no urgency, no fear. Their bodies, once guarded, met with intention. Breath for breath, heart for heart. They did not speak of what came next. They didn't need to. The silence between them now was no longer absence, it was presence. Spring carried on. Reed still worked the land, mending, hauling, planting where soil allowed. Awanada planted onions along the fence line, her belly not yet showing, but her hands moving with new care, as though every touch mattered. She mended her dress again, patch by patch, until it no longer looked torn but worn with pride. The cabin changed too. A second shelf by the table, hers for her things. A cradle, half carved, standing by the hearth. The divider Reed once built for privacy now stood as reminder, not need. Their lives were no longer separate corners. They were one shared space. Reed still walked to the grave, some Sundays, but not every week. When he went, Awanada came once, kneeling beside him, laying a single white stone at the cross. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her presence was enough. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Reed stood on the porch, leaning against the post he'd set years ago. Awanada came beside him, one hand resting on her waist, the other shielding her eyes from the light. The hills stretched wide before them, green sprouting through mud. Birds circled overhead, mules brayed from the pen. You still think this ranch has a future? She asked. Reed looked out at the land, then at her, strong and steady beside him. Because you're in it, he said. And in that moment there were no more graves that ruled him, no more auctions that defined her, no more silences that punished. Only the land, the cabin, the ring, and the promise of what they had chosen together. For the first time in both their lives, they were not surviving anymore. They were living. By April, the land had woken. Snow gave way to mud. Mud gave way to soil soft enough to plant. Reed Holston stood at the edge of his field, leaning on a post he had set years ago, watching the first green sprigs of onion push through the thaw. Beside him, Awanada crouched low, her hands working the soil with practiced care. Her belly carried only the faintest fullness, but her movements had changed, slower now, more deliberate, as if she carried not just her own life, but the shape of tomorrow. Reed watched her, the curve of her back, the strength in her hands, the steadiness in her jaw. For 10 years, his life had been measured in chores, in mending, in keeping the ranch alive just enough to survive. Now, for the first time, he saw the land not as something to hold together, but as something that could grow. Inside the cabin, changes marked their days. The cradle by the hearth, half carved, waiting for his hand to finish it. A second shelf filled with her things, bits of cloth, thread, beads she had kept, herbs she gathered from the hills. The ring rested in its carved box, no longer a relic of grief, but a marker of choice. Even the silence had changed. Once it had been the sound of punishment, of emptiness. Now silence was presence, peace. Reed still walked to the grave some Sundays, not every week. When he did, Awanada sometimes joined him, laying a small white stone at the cross. No word spoken, just shared space between past and present. Reed no longer told his wife that nothing had changed. He told her the truth. Everything had. In Redstone Crossing, they had called her stubborn, unsellable, cursed. But here, she had become something else. Not a captive, not a shadow. A wife, a partner, a future. And Reed, the man who once believed himself buried alongside the woman he lost, now found himself living again. Their bond had not come from vows or papers. It had been forged in silence, in work, in snow, in truth. It had been earned, not claimed. One evening, as the sun slid low across the ridge, Reed stood on the porch, his arm loose around Awanada's waist. She leaned into him, eyes steady on the horizon. The land stretched wide before them, soft and golden in the light. "You still think this ranch has a future?" she asked. Reed looked out at the fields, at the fence line, at the cabin behind them, where smoke curled soft into the evening air. Then he looked at her. "Because you're in it," he said. The answer settled between them, quiet but certain. The wind moved through the budding trees, carrying the sound of life returning. Birds nested under the eaves, the mule brayed in the pen. And in the cabin, the fire burned steady, waiting for them to return inside. For the first time in both their lives, Reed Holston and Awanada were not just surviving, they were living together for good. If this story spoke to you, leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more frontier tales of love, loss, and survival. Every voice in the comments helps bring these stories to life. Until next time, thank you for listening.